Well, I want to welcome everyone to our November 14th Bud Metheny chapter meeting. We are fortunate to have author David Krell speak with us tonight. David is a noted historian and author. His passion for baseball began in childhood with reading books like John Rosenberg's The Story of Baseball, New Jersey's Little League teams. He's a regular speaker at Hall of Fame and Society for American Baseball Research conferences, in addition to the Mid-Atlantic Nostalgia Convention. David's books include 1962, Baseball and America in the Time of JFK, Do You Believe in Magic? Baseball and America in the Groundbreaking Year of 1966, which we'll be discussing this evening, and Our Bums, the Brooklyn Dodgers in History, Memory, and Popular Culture. David also edited anthologies of the New York Yankees in popular culture and the New York Mets in popular culture. So David, I would like to welcome you to our meeting, and the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me. It's always a privilege to talk to like-minded baseball folks. I embarked on a labor of love with this book about 1966. Do You Believe in Magic? Baseball and America in the Groundbreaking Year of 1966. So I want to talk about three things: the culture of the year, the business of baseball, and the baseball season, specifically the World Series.
David, why did you pick 1966? What was about it?
Perfect segue. Picked it because it hadn't been done. I hadn't seen any scholarship. And if you're looking for a book and you can't find it, that's probably the book you should write. There were so many things going on in that year, and it's right before the counterculture became mainstream to a degree. It's before the war escalated in Vietnam to a fantastic degree, and I don't say fantastic in a good sense, just as an adjective. 66, things were changing. The culture was changing. One of the biggest things, as you may recall, was Batman. Now, Batman changed the scope of television because not everybody had a color television in 1966. Not every television show was in color in 1966. If you'll recall, the first 5 seasons of the Andy Griffith Show, black and white, both seasons of The Munsters, both seasons of The Addams Family, first season of Get Smart, first season of Gilligan's Island. So color TV was still a bit of a reach. It was, I don't know if I would say it was a novelty, but I think we might be safe in saying that it was indeed a novelty. Certainly by the 70s, that all changed. By the late 60s, everything was in color. But Batman was a comic book on screen. No one had used color like this. And if you look at the actors and actresses who played the villains and villainesses, they were over the top, but even more over the top than the comic books, because it had to be that way. But you needed amazing actors to pull this off. And you did. You had David Wayne. You had Roddy McDowell. You had Cesar Romero, Julie Newmar, Burgess Meredith, Victor Buono, Ida Lupino, Liberace, Van Johnson, Art Carney. These were fantastic actors who really brought their A game. And of course, kids thought it was amazing. Adults knew it was camp. And it sparked a superhero trend that year. Just to set the tone, there was a superhero trend that lasted about a year. Fall of 66, CBS puts its entire Saturday morning lineup into the superhero genre. They marketed it as Super Saturday. There were other shows like Captain Nice, The Green Hornet, and Batman is off the air by 68. 2.5 seasons, you could say 3 seasons technically. January of 66, it goes on the air. 2.5 years later, it's done. Spy genre was big, of course. You had I Spy, you had the James Bond movies, you had the Matt Helm series, you had The Man from U.N.C.L.E., Get Smart. Some of you may remember a comedy team, Alan and Rossi. They did The Last of the Secret Agents, which was a spoof. So that was big because of the Cold War, but it was really sparked by James Bond in 1962 with Dr. No. And culturally, in politics, you had the first Black woman on the federal judiciary, nominated by Lyndon Johnson early in the year. Republicans were playing some political games, and she was confirmed not until the summer. Now, why does that matter? Why do I mention that in the book? Constance Baker Motley. Why is she important? Well, not just for being a breakthrough judge in terms of being the first Black woman on the federal judiciary. She figures prominently later on in two baseball cases, which I'll detail very quickly. Number one, Melissa Lutke was a sports journalist in the 70s, wanted access to the Yankees clubhouse, Yankee Stadium clubhouse, couldn't get it. She was a woman. They wouldn't let her in. And a lawsuit ensued, and the judge said, look, bar whoever you want, but you have to bar all of them. If you're going to bar somebody in a category, you have to bar everyone in that category. You can't just pick and choose, because the locker room is where leads are developed, where rapport is built with players, where you get scoops, and you can't prevent her from doing her job. So that was one case. The other was the Brooklyn Dodger bar and grill case, where a couple, I think 2 or 3 guys in Brooklyn started a restaurant and got sued by Major League Baseball and the Los Angeles Dodgers because they thought it was infringing on the trademark. And the judge said, hey, you abandoned Brooklyn. You don't use the trademark to any significant degree, so you lose. It was David versus Goliath. You don't use the term anymore. And I think that's when leagues and teams got more sophisticated about their legacy intellectual property. I think if you go to the trademark office website and you look up some ABA teams, you might find that those team names are now owned by the NBA because there is value in nostalgia. So that just kind of sets the tone in a very thumbnail sketch kind of a way in terms of what was going on in the culture. Regarding the business of baseball, Marvin Miller, some of you may think he belonged in the Hall of Fame years ago, if not decades ago. Well, he gets the union job in '66. It was not unanimous in terms of his likability. Some people did not want him there. Veterans did not want him there. The reason being, if you've been playing for a few years, you figure that you have a pretty good rapport with the ownership, and here comes some interloper. You think he's going to ask for the moon, going to tick off the front office, and then you're gone. Well, Miller saw it a different way. First of all, he said to the players, I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm just going to help you formulate a strategy. I want to know what you want. So he listened. And one of the things he listened to was the quality of life issue of a ball player. For example, if you go on a road trip and you come back on a Monday, do you play Monday night or do you get a break? Things like that. And I think we're safe in saying that he did revolutionize how players were paid. He did revolutionize the business side of baseball. And players today can certainly thank him for everything that he did posthumously. They can thank him. He belonged in the Hall of Fame years ago, and I'm sure there are some people in this room who believe that. Now, there's another part to Miller which really had nothing to do with him, but I think intangibly it helped boost his power and influence, and that's the Koufax-Drysdale salary holdout. I had heard a little bit about it before I started my research. I did not know that it lasted a month, from late February to late March. If you're a Dodgers fan in 1966, you feel pretty good. Let's just do a recap. Since they went to LA in 58, they won the World Series in 59. They forced a 3-game playoff with the Giants in 62. The Giants won. They sweep New York in 63. They win the World Series in 65 in 7 games. So you look pretty good in 66 to a Dodgers fan. Well, this really causes a lot of consternation, this salary holdout for Dodger Nation. Not only Southern California's National League fan base, but also The general managers across the National League are getting very nervous because if Koufax and Drysdale aren't visiting on road trips, that means less revenue. Not as many people will buy tickets. That means there won't be as many people at the concession stands, not as many people parking. You're going to lose a significant amount of revenue if you don't have two of the best pitchers in baseball coming to your ballpark. So that was a concern that needed to be addressed. Chuck Connors, whom you may recall played the Rifleman, was also in a show called Branded. He was the person who intervened and got the parties together, the two pitchers and the front office. Now, how do we know this? Well, if you buy the book and you go to that section, you'll see a photograph of Buzzy Bavasi, the Dodgers GM, Sandy Koufax, Don Drysdale, and Chuck Connors. Connors is at the press conference. He's not in the front row. He's not on the side. He's not behind them. He's at the table. So he played a significant role in getting these guys together. Connors played professional baseball. He played in the Cubs organization. He played in the Dodgers organization. So he had a pipeline to both parties. He must have. And there was talk, you may remember this, there was some talk about Koufax and Drysdale becoming actors, quitting baseball entirely. The bottom line is they wanted more money. Now, certainly the Dodger players wanted them to get everything they could because they knew they couldn't get to the World Series without them. And certainly Dodger fans wanted that. Players wanted them to get it because if they're going to get that money, that means in all likelihood, other salaries will be raised. And I think that was kind of a 1-2 punch for players to start escalating their demands and escalating negotiations with management. So let's talk about the baseball season. The pennant race was a three-way race between Pittsburgh, San Francisco, and LA in the National League. This goes down to the wire. In Baltimore, they win around the 21st of September. Now, you are all baseball fans, so you know what happens when your team clinches 2 weeks before the end of the season. You rest your starters. Not every error is crucial. Not every game is crucial. You can relax. The mental pressure is off. Dodgers didn't have that. So they battle it out, and finally they win at the end of the season. They go to the World Series. If you ask Dodgers fans what happened, they will tell you, most likely to a person, my guys were exhausted. That World Series should not have been lost in 4 games. We cannot say with any confidence that Baltimore dominated because Baltimore won 2 of those games, 1-0. So they were able to win. There's something to be said for exhaustion, but they're professionals and they had to deliver. It's an interesting footnote, I think, just to be acknowledged. Yeah, you know what? They went right into the World Series. Mo Drabowski is one of the heroes of that 66 World Series. We hear a lot about Frank Robinson. He won the Triple Crown. He comes from Cincinnati. The Cincinnati executive said he was over the hill in not so many words. So Frank Robinson goes to Baltimore, does a fantastic job and leads the O's to the pennant and the World Series. But Mo Drabowski was certainly not a Hall of Fame player, but he had a Hall of Fame day. He had started this season as a relief pitcher. They changed him. He was a journeyman starting pitcher, comes to Baltimore, and they changed him to be in the bullpen. So Dave McNally gets in a little bit of trouble, and Hank Bauer, the manager, calls in Mo. And as a baseball card says, the following season, Mo mows him down, strikes out 11, I believe, a World Series record for a relief pitcher. He was just on. But there's a sad postscript to that story. 7 years to the date before that game, Mo and his wife lost their infant daughter to leukemia. So if you believe in heaven and you believe in angels and you believe in fate and karma, and all that stuff, that will reinforce it. If you don't, I hope that story will nudge you a little bit towards believing. And there's a poem at the end, after chapter 12, that you'll see. It's called Drabowski on the Mound, and it recounts his career, his life, his daughter Deborah. And I dedicated the book to two people, Deborah, who died at 2 months old, and my mom. So it's one of those rich stories about baseball, and the Drabowski family could not have been nicer about letting me put that story in there and helping me shape it and chronicle it. And I'm forever indebted to them. As soon as I heard the story, I knew I wanted it in there. And I think 66 can also be, in conclusion, a look at the future. This was the last year of the Dodger dynasty for a while. Koufax retires in November, and the Dodgers don't get back to the series until 74. They lose to the A's, and then they go back in 77 and 78, lose to the Yankees, finally winning in 81. And in the AL, the Orioles have a bit of a dynasty themselves. Not 67 or 68, but 69, 70, 71. They win the AL pennant every year. They win the World Series one of those years, and it's one of those overlooked teams. So I just think it's one of those lines of demarcation, 1966. It's sort of culturally before everything went a little off. It's before things opened up in terms of entertainment on what was allowable on television. It's before expansion in 69. It's before the counterculture, as I mentioned. It's preceding or starting, maybe is a better word, the O's dynasty. And it's really, as I say, the last year of the Dodger dynasty in the National League, which had been going on since 1947. I'll see if I get my years right. 47, 49, 52, 53 in the World Series. 55, they win the World Series. 56, they lose to the Yankees. 59, they win, and we talked about what happens after that. So with that, I thank you for your time, and I'm glad to answer any questions that you have.
I think that listening to you talk about the dynasty of the Dodgers and all, and by the way, I haven't read the book because I've had this block against it because I was a huge Dodger fan, and I hate the year 1966, and I hate that year for, Koufax retiring. I was a kid. But anyway, I'll probably still read the book. But I also think that was, and maybe in the last year, that it was not a New York team or an ex-New York team, the Giants, the Dodgers,
right,
the Yankees, not in a World Series since, I think you said, 1947. I think 47, it was Yankees or Dodgers or Giants in every single World Series. Interesting.
There's another eerie parallel, and I use the word eerie loosely. I'm a pop culture guy, which you can probably tell from my writing and speaking. In the 50s, when television began, I mean, technically it had begun quite some time before, but 1948 is when Milton Berle becomes the first TV star with Texaco Star Theater. So TV grows exponentially in the 50s, and the Yankees and Dodgers pretty much dominated that decade. I know the Giants went to the World Series a couple of times as well. Well, when TV production moves to LA, so did the Dodgers. And in the 60s, it's the Dodgers on television. It's the Dodgers in the World Series. It's the Dodgers on the Beverly Hillbillies, on the Munsters, on the Joey Bishop show. Everywhere you look, it's a Dodger here, a Dodger there, a Dodger everywhere. So I just think that's an interesting parallel, that once TV moved, it seemed like the Dodgers' ascendancy to superiority didn't stop.
And that doesn't even include Danny Kaye's great song about the Dodgers.
That's right. That's right.
David, are you is your primary interest in? I mean, I love these books that tie baseball to the culture of the time.
Right.
And I was a 66 was the end of my second half of my freshman year in college,
Right.
and the first half of my sophomore year. So I lived that era. But is your interest first in baseball or in pop culture?
I think my interest first is in pop culture, and my goal, Ray, is to write this almost as a primer, that if you were going to get in a time machine and go back to December 31st, 1965, and spend the year there, I would give you this book before you go and say, read this. It'll give you an idea. It'll give you a flavor of what was going on. And certainly the book could have been 700 pages. If I wrote the book I wanted to write, you could do 100 pages on the World Series. Yeah. You could do 100 pages on Koufax and Drysdale alone. But reality is what reality is. So I tried to condense as much as I could. And there's a lot that I had to leave out. But my goal in writing about just about anything, but certainly when I'm doing a book about a year, is to say, okay, yes, here's what was going on in baseball. Here's what was going on around baseball. So, for example, I'm working on a book about 1978 right now. Well, 1978 is also when Robin Williams unveiled Mork on a Happy Days episode and then got his own sitcom from that, Mork and Mindy. Mm-hmm. I remember the night that show aired, and I remember the next day every kid in school talking about it because we all watched Happy Days Tuesday nights at 8:00. So I'm trying to give people an idea of what was going on in the time. Now, I was born in 67, so my research came from interviews, contemporaneous news articles, YouTube, and so forth.
So it's interesting. I was fascinated. I mean, I loved your book about 1962 as well.
Oh, thank you.
And that was, so these books are really things that I look forward to. And you're right. After I finished the book, I said, this could have been a lot longer. I mean, there was so much because of living through this era. Well, but your discussion of Star Trek, for example, Star Trek. I was in 65 when I was a freshman. As a freshman, I pledged a fraternity. We went through Hell Week in January of 66 and became brothers. And Star Trek came out in the fall of 66. Mm-hmm. And it's amazing the impact of that one TV show on the fraternity house that was full of jocks, because all of us were football players or baseball players, or both. And we used to fight over seats in the TV room for Star Trek and so on. And it's interesting seeing how my experience paralleled your sense of change that was occurring in 1966. After football season, all of us football players decided if we weren't going to do a winter sport, that we were going to grow our hair long. Right. Well, we grew our hair long, and baseball season started. The coach said you can't come into the field house until you cut your hair. Right. So within a couple of years, we all had long hair, and so it was that era is very, obviously very, very interesting for me because I lived it. Right. And so, almost every page of your book brought some back some very, very fond memories.
Thank you.
And sometimes some scary memories too.
Oh, sure. I mean, one passage I worked really hard on was the one about suburbia and the middle class, and talk about business deals and sales at department stores, then segueing into Vietnam and whose kid in town just got drafted, because I could imagine those things happening. And I'd read about those things happening. So I wanted to give a certain importance to it. It wasn't escalating to the point, certainly, that it did in 67 or 68, but it was still around.
Yeah.
And certainly, I mean, you could testify to it that, you know, it was hovering. It was hovering. People were drafted. You were seeing your friends go off. And I wanted to make sure that people didn't have this Leave It to Beaver attitude of the 60s. It wasn't all Green Acres and the Beverly Hillbillies. There was a lot of serious stuff going on.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there were even people drafted out of college.
Yeah.
You know, draft boards didn't meet their quota. I have a good friend of mine right now that I've known for a number of years. I played softball with, who was drafted out of college and went back to college after 4 years in the Air Force. And I had a teammate of mine on the baseball team at where I went to college who was drafted because his draft board didn't meet his quota. So
one of the things, just as a caveat regarding the length of the book, I just think paper costs are so significant right now. You might see across the board publishers reducing the number of pages in their books. I would just anecdotally, I would just, you know, keep an eye out for that.
Mm.
Another factor, because I was in the same generation as Ray, and another fact that occurred then, and I lived this side of it, was that even though the draft was hovering, a lot of young men, including myself, were faced with a decision of knowing that it was in the future and you didn't know what would happen.
Right.
And you couldn't go out and get a job. Like, I graduated from college in 1966, and I was lucky enough to get a job. But a lot of people could not get jobs because the first question in an interview was, have you satisfied military service, or do you in a reserve unit or something? And so that was a factor definitely too. And also, I think Carl alluded a few minutes ago to the fact of the lack of New York teams. I'll kind of switch us back to baseball a little bit, in that it was the era of the decline of the Yankees.
Yeah.
And I, again, happened to observe firsthand, because the job that I got was in the Baltimore area, or Baltimore, Washington area. And I went up to Maryland in the summer of 1966 for that job, and witnessed the excitement of the city over the Orioles, because they were really, though they became very successful, this was the first year. They had done well back in 1960 and finished second. But this was the year that they came on the scene really with the first true success. And the spirit around Baltimore, I lived in the suburbs, but the spirit was, it was a new feeling that the city had about baseball and the excitement of the Orioles. In fact, I was not an Oriole fan, and I kind of got sick of it at times, going to the office and hearing people talk about, oh, the Orioles, Orioles, Orioles. And I was a Tigers fan, and they were one of the Orioles' primary competition in that year.
With respect to the Chuck Connor's role in the Drysdale Koufax holdout,
right?
Yeah, he played very briefly with the Dodgers. What, 51, I think it was, or something like that. Do you know the details of how he got involved? Because he and Koufax and Drysdale weren't actually together with the Dodgers. He was already in show business and acting in TV and movies when they came up as young players.
Well, a couple of things. Number one, when you're in LA, you have a pipeline to show business, because the show business folks are coming to the games. That's number one. On my supposition, I could be wrong, is that because of his baseball connection, he probably knew them through that. Whether he went to spring training, or whether he knew them from parties or socializing, or just come to the ballpark. I have no idea. And I don't know who he went to first. I don't know if he went to Mr. Bavasi first before the pitchers, but it's pretty evident that he was instrumental in getting the parties together after a month.
Wasn't at that point, wasn't Drysdale appearing in shows? Like, wasn't he making cameo appearances at that time? I thought maybe he and Connors came across each other not only on the baseball side, but on the acting side
My
as
guess is
well.
he knew. My guess is Mr. Connors knew them before, before Sandy Koufax was on Mr. Ed, and before Don Drysdale was in. He was in a Western show. Might have been The Rifleman, but I don't. I don't know specifically,
Yeah.
but I do know that when the Dodgers came to LA, they did have people in the stands who were the biggest people in show business. So it's not it's just not unfeasible for that to happen.
Did you, having not read your book, did you build in any storyline around Bill Russell and becoming the first African American head coach in
No,
sports?
and I just looked it up real quick. Don Drysdale was in The Rifleman. No, I didn't really. I focused on other sports. There just wasn't enough time. And
Yeah, I just didn't know in the civil rights if that kind of ran through the.
Well,
That was one of the.
I knew I needed something about civil rights, and that's when Judge Motley came to my attention, and I said, "Well, I think that's going to be significant, mostly because she tied into those two baseball cases later on in her career." And we just had Judge Jackson a couple of years ago become the first Black female Supreme Court justice. Well, I believe in her testimony or an interview or both, she referenced Judge Motley. Judge Motley certainly was on a track, and I guess whatever president might have submitted her name might not have felt comfortable, didn't think she would get the votes, what have you. I have no idea, but certainly she was formidable on the federal bench.
Well, those were interesting times, as we all, I think, perhaps not Drew, lived through them. But I hope you don't have an anti-Dodger bias, though, because
no, not at
you
all.
wrote a book about 1962. That was another awful year for the Dodgers, and
well, you
the
say
playoffs to the Giants.
Wait a second, Carl. You say awful. You say awful. Maury Wills stole 104 bases. Don Drysdale wins the Cy Young. It's the first year of Dodger Stadium, and it seems for a while it's a team of destiny.
Yeah. So but I was a 12-year-old kid rooting for them, and the Giants won it,
Sure, but they swept the Yankees the following year, 65, 66. Koufax is dominating. Of course, he retires, but geez, such a dominant 5-year span from 62 to 66.
Oh, it was a wonderful time. Yeah.
A great time to be a Dodgers fan.
Yeah. And you could turn on Milton Berle's show and see Koufax and Drysdale and all those guys.
Wasn't the 66 football season the season of Super Bowl I?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah.
In your research, did you see anything about, because the NFL was obviously had come into its own back in the late 50s,
right,
especially with the Colts Giants game, the overtime game in what was that, 59 or whatever.
Right.
But
58.
58, yeah. I wondered if there was anything suggesting the impact that pro football was having on baseball that you came across at that point.
No, not really, Ray. As I said, it was too difficult to get everything in that I wanted to. So some things had to go by the wayside. I wanted to include a section about the Packers. The Packers were dominant. I wanted to include a section about the Celtics. The Celtics were dominant, but there just wasn't enough room to to do those sorts of things. And
is that, I'm curious, is that not enough room because the publishers put that kind of pressure on you, or was it because you felt that it would just make the book too long?
Oh, the book would be too long because there were other things I wanted to get into, and I can't get in everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a list of topics, and some had to go or some had to be truncated. There's a section about Caesar's Palace. I had to truncate that. The Batman stuff, certainly I could have gone on for another 50 pages, but I had to make a decision on, okay, do people really need to know all these different superhero shows? Do they really need to know all these spy programs? Let me focus on Koufax and Drysdale. Let me focus on that. And even with that chapter, a lot of other interesting stories had to fall. Baltimore was set to have, or I shouldn't say set, it was in the running to have an NHL franchise. And that did not happen. It never happened. Baltimore never got an NHL franchise, but there was a lot of talk in the Baltimore papers about that possibly happening. So that would have been a wonderful tie into what somebody else had mentioned about Baltimore. I think it was Francis, how Baltimore, the Orioles put Baltimore on the map in '66, and there was this outpouring. Well, you referenced the Colts. The Colts certainly captured the passion of the city. It was a football city.
Mm-hmm.
66, it became more expansive. I wanted to get a section in there about what could have been with the NHL and chart that and the day-to-day reports of expansion in the hockey league, but I just didn't have the space. Because if I did that, then something else would have to go that I thought was more important. You have to start making choices, and it's difficult, but you really have to make choices that are for the better of the story. I don't know if I worded that correctly, for the good of the story.
Yeah.
One of the precepts of writing is, and you probably know this, you have to be prepared to throw your darlings overboard, those beautifully constructed pages. But there's another side to that. You have to throw away your topic list sometimes. You might have 15 topics, but you can only get to 9.
Yeah.
So 6 are going to have to go.
So what was the one you hated to lose the most?
Well, that's a great question. Well, the Batman stuff, Caesar's Palace, certainly I wanted to do more about Caesar's Palace and how that was opening up, because the word groundbreaking is in the subtitle. And it's funny how most of Caesar's Palace's big competitors are gone and Caesar still stands. It's innovated throughout the years. It's renovated throughout the years. It's added on throughout the years. So I thought that was really, really interesting how it revolutionized customer service. I wish I could have done more on the World Series and the pennant race. You could do a whole book just on the 66 pennant race.
Mm-hmm.
And there are books by certain publishers which just focus on pennant races in different leagues. I mean, it's fascinating to me that the Giants, I believe 5 out of 10 years were in second place. That's a fascinating story.
Yeah.
The 1962, yeah.
And there were so many players who deserve mention, but when you only have a limited amount of pages, okay, well, if I have 4 pages on Orlando Cepeda or Willie McCovey or Jack Sanford, that's 4 pages that I don't have about Joe Moeller or Jeff Torborg, or both of whom I interviewed, or Koufax and Drysdale on the holdout. So it's a mix and match. You know, where do you really want to put your efforts?
That was the time. Also, did you have? I'm sorry again. I haven't read your book. How about music?
I have a section about music. Yeah, because it was so rich. I'm glad you asked that. There is a small section about music that there was something for everybody in the 60s, especially the mid to late 60s. You had Motown, you had the surfing sound. sometimes called the California sound. You had hard rock, you had folk.
Yeah, the Beatles.
The Beatles, the British Invasion, the girl groups, Motown,
Monkeys.
the Monkeys, right. You had so much depth, and there were love songs. It was songs of inspiration, songs of hope. It was a special time. It must have been a great time to be a kid.
Yeah,
there was so much depth in popular culture, and I experienced a little bit of this through the 70s and 80s in that you had a limited amount of options. So if you're living in a 3-network universe, everybody's singing off the same song sheet. If you have a couple of top 40 stations, everybody's listening to the same DJs. So when you go to school the next day, when you go to the office the next day, hey, did you see Ed Sullivan? Hey, did you see I Spy? You were all sharing in the culture, and that's something that's terribly lost.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we could talk for another hour about peak TV and all the cable options and streaming and so forth, and they're all wonderful. But there is a downside in that if I say to you, oh, have you seen The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel? It's a great show. You might say, oh, I've heard of it. You know what? I'm going to binge 5 episodes this weekend. That's the culture we live in now.
Yeah.
There's
I got a
autonomy.
question for you.
There's autonomy, but it comes at a cost.
I got a purely baseball question, and you can spit it into the culture if you want, because I know you didn't have enough time to write everything that you wanted in the book. But there were 3 major upsets in World Series in the 60s. The Pirates beating the Yankees was the most dramatic in 60.
Right.
The Mets beating the Orioles was the most amazing. But the 66 World Series was not only an upset, it was the most one-sided World Series ever, period. Just completely dominated one team over the other based on runs, hitting, defense, and you name it. And particularly defense, Tommy Davis, for example, versus Brooks Robinson. So kind of my question really is, you had this team out of nowhere that squashed a legendary team.
Right.
Culturally, how did that go over for the rest of the nation? Did they say, that's exciting, or I'm not doing this anymore?
I don't know.
Tell you what I thought.
I don't know that I would accept the premise of the question, because as I say, I don't think it was dominant. 2 games, 1-0, not terribly dominant. But they were able.
We can argue that, but it is statistically the most one-sided series.
Well, if you're talking about the batting, if you're talking about batting average, we can have that discussion. Yes, the Dodgers' offense was not where it should have been. Willie Davis made 3 errors in a half inning. There were certainly some things that even Dodger fans whom I interviewed were scratching their heads, saying, where are my guys? I think you do have to how do I say? You have to take into account the fact that, they were pretty tired. At the end of the day, you are what your record is. Yes, they lost, but I don't think a Dodger fan of the 60s, and Carl will back me up, has any reason to point to the record with anything other than pride, considering they won in 63 and 65. You're not going to win everything, but they won 2 out of the last 3 they were in, and that was in a 4-year span. That's pretty good. That's a pretty good deal. And look, some people will say, well, the Dodgers didn't have to score a lot of runs in the National League because they had the 2 best pitchers in baseball. And my response to that is, well, the Dodgers didn't have to score a lot of runs because they had the 2 best pitchers in baseball.
Carl, what were you going to say?
I thought the Dodgers had a great season.
I'm just talking the World Series.
Well, before I mentioned the World Series, I kept score of every game that year, and the Dodgers never lost 3 games in a row that year. They were a hell of a team. What did I feel? I didn't realize. I was 16 years old. I didn't realize. I didn't realize about the being tired story. But as you all have said, I mean, it was, they didn't score any runs. I mean, they didn't score any runs. And yes, I was watching and keeping score when Willie Davis made 3 errors, and it was awful. Yeah, I mean, I was a huge Dodger fan ever since they left Brooklyn, strangely enough, and I'm from New York. But I was a big Koufax, Drysdale, that Maury Wills, Tommy Davis, Willie Davis, Ron Fairley, all those guys, that era. And yeah, that was a great era. And unfortunately, 66 was kind of the end of it, especially when Koufax just retired. But so I was proud and happy to be a Dodger fan during that time frame. 66 was a hugely disappointing time that certainly rivaled 1962 playoff. Although that was a great season too. But Dodgers had a way of losing too, you know.
And again, the Orioles, whom somebody nicknamed the baby birds because they were so young, as they matured, they became really, really significant. I mentioned that 69 to 71 run. I put that up there.
Great pitching,
great pitching. And I put that up there with the Royals of the mid to late 70s. I don't think that squad gets enough credit. They lost to the Yankees in the ALCS. That's why. But great players. George Brett, Amos Otis, great players.
Yeah.
I think if my recollection is correct, the Willie Davis errors occurred in that first game, the one in which Drabowski pitched, I believe. And that was the only game that really was one-sided, I believe. You know,
well, it depends how you define one-sided. By the score, not so much, but by the batting.
Way they play.
If the other team is batting 180, you don't have to put up many runs to win the game. And look, the Orioles were able to do it. The score is what the score is. Does it really matter if it's 11-3 or 1-0? No. They were able to find a way to win. And I just think there's so many interesting things about that year. Mo, with the strikeouts, Frank Robinson really just making Cincinnati executives eat crow for letting him go, making those hits all over the place, becoming a beloved fixture in Baltimore as he was in Cincinnati. He's still an iconic figure in Baltimore.
Yeah. One thing that I think we've talked about and David, you've talked about the Vietnam conflict and its effect nationally. But another thing that was going on, and I'm sure this probably, I'll put myself into your mind, had to be something you probably hated to de-emphasize in any way, were other political factors going on in the country, most notably the civil rights situations.
Well, you can't do a book about the 60s without mentioning civil rights. And a problem I ran into with 62 was people telling me, oh, you're going to talk about James Meredith, right? First Black student at the University of Mississippi. And I thought about it and I said, well, what value can I really add to that story? What am I going to tell you about Mr. Meredith that you don't already know? Nothing. He's told the story. Documentaries have told the story. Books about the civil rights have told the story. So about the civil rights movement. So I found Dr. Mary Early, who was the first Black graduate at the University of Georgia. And she graduated in 62. And I went down to Athens, Georgia to see her papers. She gave me an interview on the phone, lovely woman. And I think you have to find things that are maybe unsung, people who are unsung. And that's how I got to Constance Baker Motley. And when I saw her name, she sounded familiar. And when I looked her up, I said, oh yeah, I wrote about her decision in my book about the Brooklyn Dodgers. So of course I have to include her. And then when I found out she was involved in Melissa's case, that just secured it. So I didn't want to do things that were just what everybody would have done, something you could find on Wikipedia, because what value do I offer if I do that? Ray said every page brought back a memory. That's the biggest compliment, because I don't want my book to be a waste of your time. I want you to put that book down after you finish it and say, geez, that was a really good use of my time. I'm really glad that I read David's book. I think that's the goal for any writer. And we have to be very careful as researchers that we just don't take what's on the internet. There are sources other than the internet, even newspaper databases. The chapter about Koufax and Drysdale and the World Series, that chapter as well, I have the LA Herald Examiner in the endnotes. Well, the LA Herald Examiner is not on ProQuest, it's not on newspapers.com, it's not on Newspaper Archive, and it's not on Genealogy Bank. So I had to fill out the form for the New York Public Library interlibrary loan and hope that I could get a library or an archive to loan the microfilm reels. And I got the entire year from an archive in Chicago, and I spent 2 weeks just uploading any article I could find on Koufax and Drysdale, every article for the month of that holdout. And then when there were standout games, I got those reports as well, and certainly for the pennant race in the World Series. Well, why did I do that if I could get the LA Times, the San Pedro News Pilot, the Hollywood Citizen News online? Why would I do that? Because the LA Herald Examiner and the LA Times were the top two newspapers in terms of circulation. And it's likely that one will have information the other doesn't. One will have a salary reported for the holdout, and the other will have a different salary figure. One will have a quote, and the other won't have a quote from that person. So I wanted to get the best of both worlds. And it's very, very helpful to do that. It takes a lot of discipline and a lot of patience, but it's well worth it to just take your time and get your ducks in a row. Because if I'm going to tell you something that you could find at the click of a button without any context or any kind of creativity, I think that's just a waste of the reader's time, and I don't want to do that.
Did Bob Hunter write for the Herald Examiner?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I like what you said about looking for the unknowns or the people that have been overlooked and all. Who was the woman that tried to get into the clubhouse, and who did she work for?
Melissa Lutke. I think it was Sports Illustrated, but don't quote me on that. And Melissa's at SABR conferences. She's writing a memoir about her experiences now. And it was just one of those legal decisions that's so clear and emphatic. It was really a wake-up call that the times are changing.
Interesting. By the way, that was the second game when Willie Davis made the 3 errors. That was the second game.
Second game,
yes.
Okay.
Yes, I just saw that. I misstated that. He made those 3 errors the day after Grabowski had his good outing.
Sad, because he was a good fielder too.
I remember there was a joke. I guess it was Johnny Carson. David, you know this, was Johnny Carson or Jack Parr doing the Tonight Show in 1966?
Carson.
Okay, he's the one that I remember made a joke that because the Dodgers, as I recall, were going to Japan after the series, and that Willie Davis had lost his ticket, dropped it 3 times at the airport, and they couldn't find him.
Just reinforces what you said about the Dodgers and Los Angeles and how important they were with that whole Los Angeles scene.
Yeah.
Absolutely. They still are.
And actually, I looked when I was looking that up a while ago, what you just mentioned, actually in Los Angeles is where the Dodgers fell short markedly, because they lost the first game 5-2, second one 6-0. Then they had the 2-1-0 losses when they went to Baltimore.
Yeah.
And ironically, Sandy Koufax started that second game because I believe the Jewish holiday. Wasn't that the year? Oh, no, that may have been 65.
I think that was 65.
Yeah.
65, and the story goes that
Yes.
Drysdale started that game and he got into trouble. Alston comes to the mound and Drysdale says, allegedly, well, Skip, I guess right now you wish I was Jewish too.
Yom Kippur.
Yeah, he wanted to take Koufax did not want to play, but look, it is what it is. Greenberg didn't play. But I think it was in the 30s in a similar instance.
And Koufax certainly made up for it in Game 7 that year.
Look, when you see pictures of Sandy Koufax after a game with his elbow in ice, your heart breaks, because as good as he was, that's how much torture he had to go through after a game. And it's a wonder that he didn't retire sooner when you hear those stories.
Mm-hmm.
Well, David, thank you for your time. We've
pleasure.
hit the witching hour of 9 o'clock. I want to be respectful of your time. One final question. How long did it take you to pull the book together?
Oh gosh. I wanted to say a year, but it was probably more like a year and a half, somewhere around there. I had started it a couple of years ago, in 2020 in a workshop, workshopping the proposal, the summary, and finding my bearings. One thing I have learned as I progress through these books is don't be in such a rush to write. Spend more time researching and outlining. You're always going to add to your research, and you're always going to be shifting the topics that you focus on. But if you front load that at the beginning, it gives you a terrific roadmap, and you have your sources. You have enough to start anyway. And I would, if I have a year, I'll take 2 months to focus on the researching and the outlining as much as I can. So that way, when I hit the ground, I'm hitting it running. And I didn't used to do that. I think a lot of writers that I've spoken to, they want to just get something on the page so they can edit it later. And I've come to the conclusion it's much better to get yourself armed with the research. And as I say, you will add to it, but get a bulk of it done. Categorize it, catalog it, organize it, label it however you can. I have a way that I label news articles so they're easy to find. I usually do it by date and the initials of the paper, and then figure out what you want to say, and you'll do it. But front load as much as you can. That's my advice to anybody.
Any interest in writing fiction?
It's funny you should ask. I get so many suggestions. Yeah, I have a couple of ideas that I'm noodling right now. Ted Curtis writes historical baseball fiction, and he spoke at our Northern New Jersey chapter a few months ago, and kind of inspired me to start thinking about things like that. And there's I wouldn't say there's fiction in my books, but if you've read 62, you know that I used a couple of archetypes of Americans when I talk about television and what they do. One was a legal secretary, one was a middle-aged insurance executive, and how television is prevalent and using them as avatars for what Americans go through. And in the beginning of the 66 book, I talk about what people were doing in different areas of the country on New Year's Eve and what they were talking about. In Philly, they're talking about Bo Belinsky and the Phillies. In Beverly Hills, they're talking about the Dodgers and the World Series, and so on. So those are things that certainly could be expanded. Yeah, I do have an interest in it, but I'm not there yet. I haven't focused on an idea enough to say, okay, that's the one where I can flesh it out.
All right.
I
Well,
was going to say
David,
one more. Can I say one more thing?
Yeah, I'm
I see that Koufax book back there, and Jane Levy's book, I guess it is.
yeah.
And I don't know if you ever heard the anecdote, but speaking of getting into locker rooms, she apparently got into a Super Bowl locker room with John Madden. She got in there because she was doing an internship, I think, and was with Red Smith, and she had his press badge. And the guys, one of the security people took her into the locker room and didn't know who she was, and then looked down at her press badge and introduced her to John Madden and all these guys. This is Red Smith, in which case the entire locker room goes crazy laughing because obviously she's not Red Smith. But
right.
Interesting story.
Andrew, I'm available for other questions, but if you have other business to conduct, I'm totally on board with that.
anyone else have anything else for David?
David, thank you. Very interesting.
You. It's available on Amazon. Do you believe in magic?
Okay.
And look forward to your 1978 book. That's more along the era I grew up in.
Me too. It's a lot of fun. That was an explosive year for baseball, and it's another one of those overlooked years. 77 gets a lot of credit and a lot of attention, and 78 doesn't. So that's why I'm working on 78.
Funny little story, David, before you leave.
Yeah.
I like the premise of your book so much I bought it twice.
Oh, thank you.
Paul knows I bought it twice.
Thank you very much.
I gave him the second copy. So
yeah, appreciate it.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks a
All
lot.
right, David. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yes.